morning, everyone. Got a hot mic? Good morning. You're hired as a Lioco introducer for life. Thanks for having me here. I wanted to talk to you this morning about a marketing strategy that has worked for us as a small winery. So the name of my talk is Facts Tell, Stories Sell, and why a small winery's narrative trumps all. This is the clicker, thank you. So I'm going to start by telling you about a wine that we produce. I'm going to tell you about it in two different ways. This is Lioco 2014 Carignan. It is made from 100% Carignan grapes that grow in the Tolini Vineyard, which is in Redwood Valley, Mendocino, California. The vineyard was planted in the late 1940s on a benchland of hard clay soil strewn with fist-sized rocks. It's an area that gets very cold at night and very hot in the day. We usually harvest this fruit at the end of September. We bring it all back to the winery. We destem most of it, but 20% of the fruit we ferment on the whole clusters. Then we press it off into neutral French oak, where it sits in barrel for 11 months before bottling without any fining or filtration. We make about 2,000 cases of this wine. It sells for $22 a bottle. You want to buy a case? Meh. This is a picture of Alvin and Frank Tolini. Frank is Alvin's grandfather. Frank Tolini was a fighter pilot in the United States Air Force during World War II. He was shot down out of the sky. He survived. He came back to California with his family. And to heal the ravages of the war, he decided to take on a project. Well, that project was planting a vineyard, which, by his own word, he hand-planted with a shovel and a couple of unsuspecting neighbors. The way he planted this vineyard was that every vine went into the ground as a singular entity. So this was before the day of wire training vineyards. The vineyard was planted head-trained, and every vine went into its own little hole, which he filled up with soil and then dug another hole, put the vine in, filled up with soil, dug another hole, and so on. And over the next 40 years, Frank Tolini and later on his grandson farmed this vineyard together. His grandson, Alvin, came of age and actually went to school for viticulture and took on the majority of the duties in the vineyard. And one day, the two of them were out in the vineyard together, and Frank Tolini said to his grandson, Alvin, I'm going to leave you the Carignan vineyard in my will under one condition. So Alvin said, well, of course, what's the condition, grandfather? And Frank Tolini said that you never rip out the Carignan, because I have watched what our neighbors have done to all of their old Carignan vineyards. They've ripped it up and replanted with whatever the most fashionable grape variety of the day is. When I die, I want to know that the Carignan that I planted lives on. This is my legacy. So Alvin said, of course, grandfather, I would be happy to honor your legacy. A couple of years later, Frank Tolini passed away. Alvin Tolini inherited the vineyard, and sort of by blood oath, the Carignan is still out there in the field. The reason that's relevant is because of the economics involved. Alvin Tolini is getting about $1,400 a ton for his Carignan grapes. If he plowed that Carignan and replanted with Cabernet, $3,000 a ton. So there's a real economic disincentive for keeping these old heritage grapes in the ground. Our winery was the first winery to buy grapes from this vineyard and to bottle 100% varietal Carignan wine. When we started buying these grapes, there was no market for Carignan. No one had even heard of it. Has anybody heard of Carignan? A couple people. When we first started, nobody had heard of it. And we made these wines, and we took them to sommeliers all over the country and told this story. And today, I'm proud to say that there are restaurants from coast to coast, even other parts outside of the country, that are now pouring Carignan by the glass in their restaurants. You want to buy a case? Maybe. The point is this: facts tell, stories sell. I still run into people out in the marketplace, people that I don't recognize. They recognize me, and they come up to me and they'll say something like, "Hey, Matt, I'm so-and-so. I used to work for your distributor in Georgia, and I love your wines, and I'm just wondering, do you still buy those Blood Oath Carignan vines?" They remember the story. They don't remember what the price was or how many cases we produced, but they remember this story. And I believe it's because these kinds of stories evoke emotion in people, and that is so important. So I want to tell you a little bit about the American wine market right now. Since 2010, it is the biggest wine market in the country. I'm sorry, it is the biggest wine market in the world. It surpassed France and Italy. There are 5,000 registered California wineries here. There are another 50,000 wineries coming in from other states. And there are about 250,000 wine labels coming in from offshore. Is it a crowded field? Absolutely. It has never been more important to be able to connect with our consumers. So what happened? How did it get to be so? I mean, just in my time, in 13 years, the number of brands, the proliferation of brands has been extraordinary. So how did we get here? I call it the democratization of wine production, and it's actually a concept that allowed a winery like Lioco to exist. So once upon a time, 25 years ago, if you wanted to be a wine producer, you had to buy a piece of land, you had to plant the vineyard, you had to build a winery, you had to equip the winery, you had to staff the winery. 4 or 5 years later, that vineyard might give you enough fruit to actually crush up and make some wine, and then you put it in the barrel, and 2 years after that, you might have some wine to sell. So it was an enormously time-consuming and capital-intensive enterprise. Today, you can do all of that on the contractual basis. So if you've got $5,000 in your pocket, you could make 2 barrels of Pinot Noir this year. You're in business. Now, my observation about most winery representatives out in the marketplace is that they tend to sell on the back of facts. They use information. It's a left brain pitch. They make this many cases out of these grapes, and they get these kinds of scores, and we've got these kinds of discounting incentives built in. It's a very one-dimensional approach. Lioco, for better or for worse, we've always done it the other way. We've always sold our wines on the back of a narrative. So it's more creative, more right-brained. We use pictures, we tell stories. It's three-dimensional. And if we're doing it really well, as I said, we're able to evoke some emotion. I was curious about this idea of evoking emotion. I wanted to see who else was doing a good job of this, not just in the wine business, but in general. And I came to this guy, Steve Jobs, right? He's the master. And I was reading a story about Steve Jobs that really resonated for me. It was the eve of his 2007 keynote speech where he was going to introduce this breakthrough technology that his engineers at Apple had founded, which was essentially cramming 5 gigabytes of storage into a device about the size of a box of Tic Tacs. It was a big deal. And Steve Jobs was going to use a slide like this at the keynote speech. 5 gigabytes of storage. And the night before, he had an epiphany about the fact that 5 gigabytes was a big deal to him, and it was likely a big deal to all the people in the tech world, but it really didn't mean much to the average Joe on the street. There was no context to it. It didn't draw out any emotion. So he scrapped that slide in favor of this one. 1,000 songs in your pocket. What did 5 gigabytes do? It put 1,000 songs in your pocket. It was one of the greatest marketing slogans of all time because it was something we could all relate to. Did we all want to put 1,000 of our favorite songs in our pocket? Yes, we did. And what did we go and do? We all went out and bought devices like that. Emotionalizing the data. That's what Steve Jobs was great at. So in my continued inquiry about this concept, I came to another guy who was a behavioral psychologist. The guy's name is Simon Sinek, and he wrote a book called Start with the Why. And in his book, Simon modeled out this very simple explanation for basically making sense of human behavior. It's called the golden circle. And this model also kind of helped me get my head around further. Why is it that consumers buy certain brands and not others that are on seemingly equal footing? So this is what Simon in the golden circle would say about the wine industry. Most winery representatives know what they sell. Hope so. And they know how that product is made. They can dazzle you with the data. And that's usually where they stop. Very few of them can articulate why they are doing what they do. The really iconic brands communicate from the inside out. They start with the why. So, a typical winery pitch might look like this. I'm Matt Licklider. I own a winery in Napa, California. We own 10 acres of benchland vineyards in Oakville. We grow Cabernet. The wines are made by our star winemaker, Joe Blow, using Bordelais methods. We elevate all the wine in new French oak. The wines get 96 points from Robert Parker. You want to buy a case? Lioco, we always started from the inside out. And again, this is something we just did probably because we didn't have an estate vineyard, nor did we have a gravity-fed winery. All we had was a point of view. So we always told stories, and our pitch started with the why. So I'm going to tell you what our pitch is. I want to tell you the Lioco story here. And this is a photograph. I don't know if all of you can see it because of the lighting in the room, but this is a picture of the founding partner and I in my car driving up through some hillside vineyards with a big full moon coming up behind us. And I think this picture really tells our story. So Lioco was found in the back alley behind Spago Beverly Hills. At the time, Kevin O'Connor was Wolfgang Puck's sommelier. I was a salesperson on the street selling French and Italian wine. And 4 times a year, I would get in a plane with a bag full of samples and fly down from San Francisco, and I would go see my clients in LA. Kevin was at Spago, was one of my best clients. The way that we would conduct business is I would come into the restaurant, we would lock eyes, he would pull a couple of glasses down off the bar, we would march through the restaurant, out the back door, into the back alley, and that's where all the tasting was done. Wolfgang Puck did not want people tasting and spitting at his bar, understandably. So I would pull out of my bag a Grand Cru Burgundy or a Clos de Menil Champagne or a Chateauneuf-du-Pape or a Cru Vineyard Barolo or something delicious. And we would pour it out into these glasses and swirl and taste and pontificate. And over many years of doing this, the conversation seeded from not just the wines in my bag, but to wine in general and who was making great wine. And boy, wouldn't it be fun to try and make some wines in California that had the same kind of personality as these traditional wines from Europe. And then that was the seed that was planted. A few years later, we sat down over breakfast in Venice Beach, California, and literally on the back of a breakfast menu, we wrote up this business plan that would position Kevin and I as the directors of a negociant winery based in Sonoma. We would use our last names as the brand, Licklider, O'Connor. The other way was O. coli, which we didn't think was quite as sharp. And we would go out there and hunt for the most compelling terroirs in California. And we would buy those grapes and bring them back to the winery. And we would make the wines in this very non-interventionalist style. And I would go out and I would bring these wines to sommeliers all over across the country who were desperate for California wines that were doing this. At the time, California wines were these big, opulent, lavish, oak-driven, alcoholic wines. And none of the sommeliers that we knew wanted those kinds of wines for their restaurant lists. So we were going to fix that. And that first year, we went out and we bought 5 tons of grapes. We crushed all that fruit at a friend's winery. We had another friend help us design the labels. And we were in business. And I packed a bag, and I went out in the market and set up distribution in 5 or 6 states. And little by little, we grew. This year, we crushed 260 tons of grapes. Kevin had subsequently moved on to other things. He's now in the restaurant business. My wife, Sarah Licklider, joined the team as the general manager. This is a picture of us doing a night pick in a vineyard in the Anderson Valley. We still don't own any vineyards. We buy grapes from about 15 different small family-owned vineyards from Santa Cruz County up to northern Mendocino County. We make all the wines in a custom crush facility in Santa Rosa. So we still operate the same way we did that first year when we bought 5 tons of grapes. Only now we're making about 15,000 cases a year. And I think you'll find these Lioco wines in the best restaurants all over the world now, from Tokyo to LA to Aspen, Charleston, New York, London, Copenhagen, Stockholm. Our wines are on all the Michelin star lists. And I think the reason for that is because we took a very firm point of view about the style of wine we were going to make, and we never wavered from it. And we stuck to our narrative, which is we believe that California has all of these great places, and we're going to go make wine from these great places. So we think we have a nice little asset. We've definitely been watching this extremely active merger and acquisition period. And we've seen a bunch of our direct competitors get snatched up by bigger companies. Whether or not that happens to Lioco remains to be seen, but right now we're having a great time. My wife, as I mentioned, she's the general manager, and she's sort of the boss. So recently she told me that it was a good thing that I was self-employed because I'm basically unemployable. And I was thinking about that. And we're also about to reprint our business cards. And I was thinking about what my title should be. Like, how am I bringing the most value to my company at this point? And what I arrived at was that my title should be CST, the Chief Storyteller, because that's what I do. I tell stories, and I have a really good time doing it. Thank you, guys.